This is a photo of my mother, Shizuko Ina. She was called to report to this center in San Francisco, Japantown. So she's standing in line waiting to get her family number on a card by which they would be identified for the rest of the time that they're incarcerated. She's pregnant with my older brother in that photo. My name is Satsuki Ina. I was born in the Tule Lake concentration camp during World War II.
Satsuki Ina's mother, Shizuko, was one of 120,000 Japanese Americans incarcerated in concentration camps during World War II. Satsuki told me over the phone that when this photo was taken in April 1942, her mother was living in San Francisco. That sign on the wall behind her is a notice posted by the U.S. Army, instructing all people of Japanese descent living in the area to register themselves and their families for evacuation or face criminal penalties.
But addressed it to aliens and non-aliens. And non-alien is, of course, a citizen.
This photo was taken by Dorothea Lange, one of the great American photographers of the 20th century. Lange took hundreds of photos of Japanese Americans in 1942, but her images remained mostly unseen until decades later.
The government was so effective at distorting the true narrative of what they did, why they did it, and what happened to the people.
Japanese Americans had been segregated from white American culture going back to the first arrival of Japanese immigrants in the late 1800s, and faced a wave of anti-Japanese legislation starting in the 1920s. But after Japan's bombing of the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack that left over 2,000 Americans dead, Japanese Americans became targets of violence and increased suspicion.
Within hours of the attack, FBI agents showed up in the Japanese American communities and removed the Issei first-generation men who had been already listed as potential threats before the war broke out.
They were labeled enemy aliens, along with some German and Italian nationals, and were to be interned for the duration of the war.
They felt that that would remove the leadership, and so the masses of Japanese could not act in concert against U.S. interests.
Gary Okihiro is a scholar and author whose work, going back to the 1970s, helped pioneer the academic field of Asian American studies.
They were satisfied with the removal of just the leaders of the Japanese American community and their detention, not a mass removal. But the politicians intervened.
Even though the Japanese American leadership was already interned, newspapers and politicians started stoking the fear of a new threat: the fifth column.
The Trojan horse, the fifth column.
A fifth column is a generic term that refers to a group within a wartime country secretly loyal to the enemy. A hypothetical Japanese fifth column was invented in newspapers and was used by politicians to justify anti-Japanese rhetoric.
Japanese Americans living in certain areas were identified as fifth columnists.
They were depicted as insidious and as threats to the government. So there was a kind of shift in public opinion.
Even though the fifth column didn't exist, the idea of it was powerful enough for the American public to demand the government do something drastic. And in February 1942, the Roosevelt administration did, by passing Executive Order 9066, which empowered the Army to forcibly remove anyone deemed a threat from strategic military areas. In this case, the entire west coast of the United States. The order didn't explicitly mention Japanese Americans, but there was no question they were the target.
Executive Order 9066 ripped people from their homes, their jobs, their education, their farms, and most people were never able to recover the loss that they suffered. My parents were incarcerated for 4.5 years.
2/3 of the 120,000 Japanese Americans removed from their homes and forced into concentration camps, including Satsuki's parents, were American citizens by birth, which, in a war supposedly being fought in the name of freedom, presented an image problem for the U.S. government.
The government was well aware that the whole experience was a problem.
The Roosevelt administration wanted to frame the removal as orderly, humane, and, above all, necessary. The government created a new department, the War Relocation Authority, or WRA, to handle the removal, and more importantly, document it through propaganda films, pamphlets, and news photographs.
They thought that documenting it would demonstrate the government's goodwill and service.
One of the WRA's high-profile hires was Dorothea Lange.
And of course, Lange was really made famous by her 1930s Great Depression photographs for the Farm Security Administration.
In 1942, the WRA tasked her with photographing the Japanese-American removal process in California. Lange photographed the rapid changes happening in Japanese-American communities, including Japanese-owned farms and businesses shutting down. She photographed families in front of the homes they owned, children attending school for only a few more weeks, this final game between friends, and a last-minute barbecue. Her captions often noted how close in time they were taken prior to evacuation, weeks, then days, then hours before removal to the camps, and the baggage piled up on the day of removal.
She captured the anxiety, the distress, but also captured kind of the dignity of how nicely dressed people were. You know, they've got their hats and coats and ties on and their high heels on.
Photos like this one weren't approved for circulation by the WRA.
They weren't very friendly to her once they saw how she was narrating visually the story.
This photo, along with many prints of Lange's, have one word written across them in cursive: impounded. Internal WRA memos from 1942 revealed that the Army was deeply concerned about Lange's photos. They described her as highly emotional, and her negatives were surrendered and the prints impounded, by order of the press relations officer for the WRA, Major Norman Beasley. Of the approximately 700 photos Lange took for the WRA, around 80 are singled out as impounded. Since the WRA owned the rights to all of Lange's photos, and Army permission was necessary to publish any of them, it's unclear what exactly the distinction was. But the impounded images seem to fall into a couple of categories. One was photos of the removal process that included armed US soldiers. So this photo showing Satsuki's mom, Shizuko, was impounded. This one, from another angle, wasn't. This photo shows soldiers boarding Japanese Americans onto buses to the so-called assembly centers, temporary prisons used while the concentration camps were built that included racetracks in disuse, where Japanese Americans were housed in horse stalls. A lot of these photos were labeled impounded too.
My parents were in a racetrack just outside of San Francisco. My mother's pregnant, placed inside of these horse stables. So she had to endure the horse stables while she was in this very fragile condition. And, you know, it was a dehumanizing process.
The other types of photos labeled impounded were images of incarcerated Japanese Americans waiting in line for food at the assembly centers, and Japanese Americans wearing US Army uniforms. Other impounded photos don't fall into a clean category, like this one of a Buddhist priest locking the doors of his church before evacuation.
She, I think, captured the fact that they were being victimized, but also held on to the humanness of who they were.
While she was working for the government, she was also working for the subjects of her photographs. And I think that's why it was obvious that the government had to impound those pictures for the duration of the war.
In July 1942, the WRA released Lange from the program, just 4 months after she started. They withheld most of her photos from the public for the rest of the war, both the ones marked impounded and the others, with a few exceptions, like this WRA pamphlet, Relocation of Japanese Americans, that included a few Lange photos. When asked in the early 1960s about her wartime experience, Lange said they had wanted a record, but not a public record. Lange wasn't the only WRA photographer whose photos were impounded. These images, by press photographer Clem Albers, who also briefly worked for the WRA, were given the same label. The WRA did endorse other photos at the time, most notably from photographer Ansel Adams, whose photos from the Manzanar concentration camp depicted happy, smiling faces and grand Western landscapes, as opposed to the more candid approach in Lange's images.
Dorothea Lange, she understood that humanity was comprised not just of happy, smiling faces, but also those that were fearful, apprehensive, amidst a whole process that sought to dehumanize them, to take away their humanity.
By 1943, the government acknowledged that no known acts of sabotage, espionage, or fifth column activity were committed by the Japanese before or after Pearl Harbor. But the last camps weren't closed until 1946, the year after Japan surrendered. That year, Satsuki's father, who had been held in a separate camp during the war, reunited with them in a detention facility in Crystal City, Texas.
So my earliest recollection is being on the train leaving Crystal City. So it was 1946 when our family was reunited.
That same year, US President Harry Truman terminated the WRA, and all of its records, including tens of thousands of photos, were moved into the National Archives in Washington, D.C. It would take another 25 years for Lange's WRA photographs to be widely seen by the public, when her former assistant requested they be pulled from the National Archives for a 1972 exhibit by the California Historical Society, Executive Order 9066. The exhibit toured the country and was featured in a 1972 NBC TV documentary, Guilty by Reason of Race.
I think the fact that it was Dorothea Lange that chronicled what happened, her notoriety, and the fact that the photos were released after they had been suppressed brought a lot of validation.
The photos revealed for many the cruelty unleashed by Roosevelt's executive order. They were also published in a book of the same name. The book, like the exhibit, showed photos of the removal process next to headlines and quotes from the time, like this one from a Los Angeles Examiner article from 1943.
EO 9066, the exhibit, I learned of it through the publication of the images and the text. It helped to galvanize our generation, the third generation's efforts towards redress and reparations.
That movement finally resulted in reparations for survivors of the camps, when U.S. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988.
This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
Nearly 50 years after the government had violated 120,000 individual people's civil liberties, the U.S. admitted it had made a mistake.
So I took a picture of my mom, she must have been in her 70s, standing in front of that photograph taken by Dorothea Lange. This is shortly after reparations. She felt like it was concrete evidence about her history and what happened to her. It gave her permission to talk more about her experience.
She has a photograph of a grandfather and a grandson in Manzanar, and she shot it going upward, so the humans stand immense in front of the Sierra Nevadas, the mountains. She also shows the older people who suffered most in the camps, and the children, the future generations, continuity, that we have a future here in this country. Her photographs demonstrated the complexity of human relationships around oppression and resistance.
Pretty much all of Lange's photos of Japanese Americans in 1942 have their own whole story behind them. Like this one of the Wanto Shokai grocery store in Oakland, California. Lange wrote in the caption that the owner, Tatsuro Masuda, hung this sign outside of his family's store the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Masuda was born in California. His father had emigrated from Japan in the 1890s and opened the family store in 1916. When Lange took this photo in March 1942, the Masudas had closed the store, following Roosevelt's executive order. They were placed in a concentration camp in Arizona. This photo, taken around 1945, shows Tatsuro with his family after they were released from the camp. Thanks so much to Jerry Naruo, Tatsuro's nephew, for sharing these photos of the Masuda family with us. As always, there's more in the description, including a link to the collection of Lange's WRA photos with the word impounded written on the prints, which are held at the UC Berkeley Bancroft Library, and a link to Satsuki Ina's award-winning documentary about her family's incarceration during World War II, From a Silk Cocoon.